Alright, you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Lil Man from Whittier Gets Moved On in High Power 1750. This story took place at the LA County Jail sometime on or around 1999 and 1750 Charlie Row. At the time, an individual by the name of Checo from Maravilla was in charge of 1750. Everything was going through him. From my understanding, Checo wasn't a made member of the Mexican Mafia during the brief time when he was running the jail. He was just entrusted with this position as a well-educated and well-rounded Sureño. However, later on, Checo would in fact get made and would become a member of the Mexican Mafia. Checo was described as a charismatic, outspoken, free-spirited type of guy who was always trying to break the monotony and crack jokes amongst others on the tier. Being that he was from Maravilla, he was from that era where the Mexican Mafia and Maravilla had a love-hate type of relationship. I don't know the details or the circumstances behind how it happened, but Checo's own homeboys from Maravilla took him out. It supposedly had something to do with Checo's choice to function as a Sureño who operated under the umbrella of the Mexican Mafia's direction. Since a lot of the Maravilla gangs broke away and separated themselves independent of the Mexican Mafia's guardianship, those from the Maravillas who chose to remain neutral and function alongside the Mexican Mafia were in essence considered to be traitors. And Checo apparently fit that bill, especially more so after he became an actual member. Not to get off track, but it's important, not only for this story, but also just to understand how the conflict between the Maravillas and the Mexican Mafia started. The Maravillas broke away from the Mexican Mafia the same way Fresno did with the Nuestra Familia. So this conflict dates all the way back from the 1950s up until the mid-2000s. During this time, almost a half century, there has existed a dysfunctional love-hate relationship between the Maravillas and the Mexican Mafia. This goes back to the Mexican Mafia's inception, dating all the way back to 1957. In those early years, the largest numerical Sureño representation in California youth and adult incarcerations were from various gangs from Maravilla. As such, they were held in high esteem and they considered themselves to be self-appointed emissaries of the Southern California Collective. Some of those gangs included Arizona, Fisher, Frazier, Gage, Kern, Mediana, Pomeroy, High Times, Juarez, Lomita, Lopez, Lote, Rock, Moraya, Maravilla Projects, MVP, Rascals, and Maravilla Rifa. Maravilla's leadership role was supplanted virtually overnight as M's elite warriors became instant superstars amongst their criminal peers. Because the MA did not discriminate in whom they chose to victimize, weaker inmates suffered equally under their wrath. The Mexican Mafia would come to be known as an equal opportunity exploiter. But the true origins of the conflict developed in 1963 when two MA enforcers, Eddie Pelon Moreno and Richie Ruiz, stabbed Tony Chacon from Lopez Maravilla to death on an exercise yard in San Quentin State Prison. This hit punctuated the Mexican Mafia's lack of tolerance for any resistance from the Southern Raza population, including Maravilla. As the MA navigated through the prison system with reckless abandon and complete disdain for anyone who did not agree with them, MA members generated a deep albeit quiet resistance to their oppressive tactics. This was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. There were a number of other incidents that would occur over the years that would continue to curry disfavor by the MA and anti-MA sentiment among the Maravilla neighborhoods, i.e., when Robert Huito Marquez instigated the conflict, and then the incident that transpired with Anthony Tonito Payne attending an MA meeting with a gun. This was taken as an act of aggression, but in the early 1990s, the Maravillas sealed the pact. They did this by openly declaring their opposition to the MA's authority and outright refused to pay taxes. These Maravilla tax resistors called themselves Los Maravillosos, the marvelous ones. The MA's response was swift and merciless. Maravilla gang members were targeted in county jails and prisons throughout California. Following the failed negotiations to clear the air with Tonito from Maravilla, where he took a gun to meet with former MA member Chuco Castro, Maravilla gang members began to tag tax-free into their gang graffiti to advertise unequivocally their continued independence of Mexican Mafia authority and freedom from MA taxation. But after nearly 4 decades of being on leper status and being ostracized by the MA and the Sureño underworld, Maravilla gang members were brought into the Mexican Mafia's criminal umbrella in the early 2000s. This was all to the credit of Alfred Chato Sandoval from Arizona Maravilla. Representing his neighborhood and utilizing his credibility as a proven and respected Mexican Mafia member, Chato was instrumental in removing Maravilla gangs from the MA's kill on sight list. Except for a small pocket of token resistance, Maravilla gang members are now considered to be sureños. The scattered few Maravilla gangs who continue to oppose the MA's rule remain on the green light list. By co-opting the Maravillas into his crew and into the sureño fold, Chato's shrewd business acumen resulted in the creation of a criminal empire within the Maravillas. From the confines of his prison cell in Pelican Bay State Prison, Chato was compensated for his coup by becoming the sole Maravilla Mexican Mafia member to control all those territories. From the early 1990s to the present, virtually no street gang between San Diego and Bakersfield has failed to fall into compliance with the criminal demands of the Mexican Mafia's version of Manifest Destiny. The MA's endeavor to control the criminal activities of every gang they have coveted has generated huge amounts of revenue and has left in its wake an unspeakable body count in the pursuit of its illegitimate American dream. Simply put, whatever the Mexican Mafia wants, they get. So I just ran a story about 1750 and I talked a little bit about the layout and the setup of how that unit is situated. But for the purpose of this story, let me give a more in-depth description. From what I've been able to gather, 1750 consists of 7 tiers. The way it's set up, it's unique from any other housing unit in the LA County Jail, with the exception of 2904. So 1750 is labeled A row, B row, C row, D row, E row, F row, and G row. G row was originally used as a deep say, or as the hole, but it later got turned into a tier for extra high-powered dudes that they wanted separated from the rest of the population because it only has 8 cells and it's tucked away in the back of the jail. Again, similar to 2904, which is another super high power or deep say. This is where they kept O.J. Simpson when he was in the county jail. They also designated one of the tiers, which was F row, as a protective custody tier. This is where they housed the Menendez brothers when they were in the county jail. All the tiers except for G row have 20 cells and they're all single man cells. There's a small booth or a control post that the deputies sit in and control all movement electronically. Anytime anyone comes out of their cell for anything, whether it's for showers, an attorney visit, a personal visit, court, or their allotted hour tier time, the deputy opens their door electronically by pushing a button. There's bars in front of the cells similar to a San Quentin or Old Folsom cell. There's also a hallway opposite the front of the cells that serves as a catwalk. This small corridor is obscured with bulletproof glass that has a one-sided mirror that runs the full length of the tier. This is so the deputies can walk down this catwalk and see into the cells. The inmates are unable to see the catwalk or the deputies walking. However, they have to enter through a door that gets popped electronically, which the inmates can hear. This is something they actually listen for so they don't get caught slipping. When they hear that door pop, somebody yells out, "Walking," or "Lente Loco." All these tiers are also completely separated from one another. In the front of the tier, there's another window that the deputies use to get a visual whenever they pop doors. This is to ensure that they watch each inmate get secured back in their cell and so that they can visibly see the doors close. But this is the thing. Back in those days, the guys that were locked up in 1750 devised a method to circumvent the feeble security system that the deputies were using to get out on the tier. They did this by simply wedging a book, a pencil, or something else that would compromise the locking mechanism. All they were basically doing is covering the latch, which would then prevent the lever from locking into place. However, this wasn't foolproof. It was one of those things that would work for a while until someone did it, and then they'd be on top of it and make the inmates physically slam their doors shut. But after a period of time would elapse, they would eventually slack back off until someone would do it again. Short of coming in and revamping their system or changing out all the locking mechanisms, this is something that was in play for quite some time. So at the time when this story took place, the following individuals were present in 1750. Artie Boy from Los Nietos, Trigger from King Cobras, Cricket from Artesia, Güero from Elm Street Watts, Smokey from Barrio Nuevo, Perico from Primera Flats, Topo from Hawaiian Gardens, Chewy from Barrio Nuevo, Scarecrow from Northside Redondo, and Lil Man from Whittier were all present on the tier. Bosco from Norwalk had Baker Row, and Veneno from Northside Redondo had Abel Row. So Lil Man, Donald Ortiz, was a member of the Mexican Mafia who had fallen out of favor behind failed obligations. According to my source, he paroled from Pelican Bay with directives or some kind of assignment that came from up top, and he apparently failed to follow through with whatever it was that he was supposed to take care of. On top of that, he went on to start hustling for himself, and this ended up being a critical mistake. Once he got himself on his feet, it was just a matter of time before the MA heard about the money he was generating. It's no secret that this is a covetous and demanding organization, and the one thing they don't like is when someone like Lil Man, who's obligated, fails to share their monetary gain. His own indiscretions would ultimately lead to his own undoing. So a little background on Lil Man. He was described as being a certified gangster. Lil Man, standing at just 5'6", was given this Picasso as it was obviously befitting for his small stature. He spent most of his 59 years in juvenile halls, youth camps, reform schools, county jails, and state prisons. He was a YA baby, having done a significant amount of time in the youth authority, jumping from one facility to the next. And it's been said by those who did time with him that this is where he earned his bones. He's the definition of someone you consider to be state raised. Years later, after growing up in the youth authority, Lil Man would continue forward in his criminal career by serving several bids in state prison. After hitting a number of different prison yards and proving himself to be a dedicated sureño, the Mexican Mafia began prospecting him out sometime in the early 1980s. Needless to say, this was during a tumultuous time for the Mexican Mafia, as this was when they were at the height of their conflict with the Nuestra Familia. Even though Lil Man was only 5'6", he compensated for his lack of size in a number of different ways. He was always more than willing to spill blood and put in work when he was needed, and he later became an effective leader. But with the good also came the bad. Due to his indiscretions and his failure to uphold his obligations, his status was stripped and he was later cast out of the organization. In situations like this, I've seen one of two things happen. There's several factors that come into play, and these things are all considered prior to someone's membership being revoked. It just depends. Your status is dependent on the seriousness of the infraction or the misconduct that resulted in your membership being revoked. Your membership can be revoked and you can be relegated all the way back down to being a sureño who's still allowed to function and program, or you can be completely cast out and targeted for murder. Unfortunately for Lil Man, those who were authorized and responsible for deciding his status chose to completely banish him and mark him for death. From what I've been able to gather, Lil Man was hit several times in prison but refused to lock it up. At one point, he was even warned by law enforcement that he was in imminent danger, and they advised him that they had intercepted credible information indicating that the Mexican Mafia had him on the hard candy list, meaning that he was targeted for death. But Lil Man refused to accept any form of protection and continued going out to active yards despite being warned about this. On two separate occasions, he signed release of liability forms so that he could be let out to these exercise yards. And on both occasions, he was stabbed. But this didn't deter him. Who knows what his mindset was? Maybe he thought he could still clean it up, or maybe he just didn't want to go out like that. But either way, he continued putting himself in harm's way. On the other hand, he was a longtime member that was well aware of the dire situation he was in and what those consequences entailed. The consequence for being a dropout, the only consequence the Mexican Mafia will tolerate, is death. These weren't situations where he pulled up to an ad say and they tried rocking him to sleep and then luring him out to a yard so that they could hit him. When he landed at these two different prisons, they excommunicated him as soon as he got there. They basically put him on dead cell status, but this still didn't sway him. My source, who knew Lil Man well, seems to think that he knew what Lil Man's mindset was. He said he thinks that Lil Man thought that maybe he could win favor and praise by the Mexican Mafia by continuing to go out to these yards and by demonstrating where his heart was at. It's an interesting prospect to say the least, and in fact, it's one that's been acknowledged by at least one high-ranking MA member. This sentiment was intercepted in 1998 in an outgoing letter by this Mexican Mafia member who wrote, "Lil Man from Whittier, now there's a vato who everybody and their grandma knew was on the lista, the hit list. And he signed that paper and they still let him out. Not once, but twice. And both times he got whacked and he still wanted to come back out to the yard. This letter was in response to a conversation where the status of another Mexican Mafia member was being weighed and compared to someone like Lil Man. It sounds like he was trying to make the point that Lil Man, being in that same situation, never wavered and continued to go out to the yard despite the fact that he was well aware of what was coming and that maybe this other member didn't. This was similar to how Lil Man was treated when he was there in 1750. Everybody on the tier knew that he was on the list and that he had an issue coming when the opportunity presented itself. But they let him coexist on the tier because as far as Checo and the other Sureños on the tier were concerned, this wasn't their business. This was Mexican Mafia business. And keep in mind that this was back in 1999 when the old set of rules were still in effect. At that time, only a made member could hit another made member. My source elaborated on this. He said, "These types of situations ain't our business. We don't get involved in that kind of stuff. We don't cold shoulder someone like Lil Man or treat him any different based on M politics. In fact, we get in trouble for doing shit like that." So Lil Man was allowed to coexist on that tier and they afforded him with the same level of respect as everyone else on the tier. With the exception of sharing hot household business, they were allowed to converse, to play chess, to share literature, and interact with him the same way they did with anyone else there. Even Lil Man himself knew what time it was. This wasn't the first time he was dealing with the situation that he was in. By this time, he had already been hit twice and he wasn't under any fake pretenses about his status. Like I said, Lil Man was a longtime member and he had seen enough backstabbing and betrayal during his years of incarceration than to allow himself to fall victim to it himself. As I said early on, my source was neighbors with Lil Man and had gotten to know him while they were housed in 1750. According to him, they had gotten real close and he actually took a liking to Lil Man. Not only based on the interaction he had with him in 1750, but also based on the merits of Lil Man's past and how he had stood on his own beliefs. Any man willing to go out and continue to face his accusers or those who keep trying to take his wind is worthy of respect on those merits alone. The one thing my source did say is this: before Lil Man had his wings clipped, he had apparently garnered the reputation of being a tyrant. He was a hardliner that was known for resorting to different forms of discipline, and he wasn't known for cutting a lot of slack. The other word my source used to describe him was bully, which doesn't surprise me because tyrant and bully kind of go hand in hand. My source said that Lil Man was known for walking around the yard with bodyguards, and he was also known for kicking off unnecessary guerra with the Africanos. He said that their homies didn't like that, and that he was low-key kind of known to kick shit off with them. Some of the discipline he meted out consisted of fighting, and this is one of those areas that's often been frowned upon. Reason being is because of the influx of not only MA members, but I can personally attest to this also applying to NF members as well, who have used fines for their own personal self-gain. This is money that's generally kept by the brother who implements the fine, so it's easy to see how this could become corrupt and taken out of context. But I bring up Lil Man's supposed reputation for being a tyrant because my source indicated that he was able to see flashes of this in Lil Man's character at different points when he was interacting on the tier. An example he gave was with respects to Checo and his personal interaction with Lil Man. When these guys would occasionally go up with a batch of pulque or pisto, jailhouse wine, Checo would get on Lil Man's helmet and try to get a rise out of him. Or when Checo would get loaded on carga, he would also get on Lil Man, as this was also tolerated on the tier as well. And this is only because Checo and Lil Man had known each other for years. They went all the way back to their YA days, and therefore none of it was ever taken to heart. My source said he could see flashes of the tyrant in Lil Man's character when Checo would get on him, but Lil Man understood his circumstances, and therefore he would bite his tongue or pull back on the tier. My source said Checo would kind of mock the predicament Lil Man was in, and that they used to go back and forth. It was all done in good faith, but Checo apparently stayed on him. So my source said that when he got to 1750 from the gang module, Lil Man had been there on the tier for about a month. And when he got there, he ended up getting housed right next to Lil Man. So the homies told him, "Look, Lil Man's cool. You can chop it up with him. We got him on roll call and everything. But when the opportunity presents itself, he's gonna get got." And again, one of the only reasons why he was somewhat safe on the tier at that time is because, like I said, the old policies were still in effect at that time where only a brother could hit a brother. But what ended up happening is several Mexican Mafia members started hitting the tier. Perico from Primera Flats was the first one to pull up, followed by Smokey and Chewy, who were both from VNE. This is when they were both brought back to the county jail to make a quick pit stop before getting shipped off to a federal facility on the federal RICO indictment they both got hemmed up on. My source said he had a feeling it was going to be all bad for Lil Man when all the Bealies started showing up. And Lil Man apparently sensed it himself as his whole demeanor changed and he kind of pulled back up off the tier. He wasn't as social or as outgoing as he was prior to Chewy, Smokey, and Perico pulling up. At this point, my source and Lil Man had been neighbors for close to a year, and like he said, regardless of the situation he was in, when you've been neighbors with someone for that long, you end up bonding with them and getting close. That's almost inevitable. So not long after Chewy and Smokey got there, the whole climate on the tier changed. To the credit of Checo, he was already running a tight program, but Chewy and Smokey were highly seasoned MM members, and just their mere presence alone changed the tempo and pace of the whole tier. Both of these individuals were senior Mexican Mafia members who were deep into the politics, and both of them were no strangers when it came to spilling blood or laying someone down. Chewy was a shrewd imero. He was a calculated thinker and always placed pragmatism before cynicism. In my opinion, Chewy was also highly underrated. He didn't get nearly the amount of credit he was worthy of. He was probably one of the sharpest and intelligent Mexican Mafia members of his time. I could easily get off track and get distracted expounding on this, but I'll save that for a future upcoming profile. So based on the subtle things my source queued up on, he could tell they were in the process of moving on Lil Man. The excessive fishing, who was involved, etc., etc. But what really cinched it for him was when they asked him to turn over one of their weapons. My source was the one holding their artillery on the tier. That was his responsibility. So when they asked for one of the bone crushers, he knew it was for Lil Man. And according to my source, the piece that was used to hit Lil Man was a flat piece of steel measuring about 8 inches long that was cut from a bunk, locker, or light fixture. He said it was a nasty piece. However, not long after that, Topo from Hawaiian Gardens told my source that he was on the short list of those being considered to hit Lil Man. This is when it became official that he knew for a fact that Lil Man was on borrowed time. I believe I already conveyed this to you guys, but just to be safe, let me cover it again. When you're in high power, only one person comes out for tier time at a time. One cell will come out, he'll get his time, then he goes back in, and then the next cell will come out, and they just keep going down the line. At the time when all this was happening, my source was only 24 years old, he weighed about $150 soaking wet, and he had a minimal amount of experience. So they opted to have someone else take on the honors of hitting Lil Man. It's not that they didn't think he could handle the job. He just thinks that they wanted someone else who was a little bigger and who had more experience. Because again, keep in mind, Lil Man was a small guy himself, but he was a little bruiser and he was known for putting up some good squabbles when they came at him in the past. So this is where Weddle from Elm Street Watts, Michael Russell, comes into this. He was the one selected to hit Lil Man. Obviously, on the day that this was scheduled to happen, everyone on the tier was advised to secure all their contraband, and they were all told that today it's going to happen. So reflecting back on that day, in retrospect, my source told me that he felt bad for Lil Man, but at the end of the day, his heart was with the fellas. It was during this brief period of time that he was able to disconnect with Lil Man. And this is one of the ugly realities of this lifestyle. Developing the ability to connect and disconnect with people you consider to be your so-called loved ones. Dropping loyalty at the drop of a dime and learning the art of deception. The same people who you'd be willing to stand side by side in battle with, or the same people who you'd be willing to take a bullet for, now get shut off and X'd out because someone else has decided that it's his time to go. It's a cold game, but this is how it's played. Dog eat dog, and you also learn how to desensitize yourself to the violence that's coming to this individual who you once called your brother. I don't know what's dirtier, rocking someone to sleep so you can play on the element of surprise and spill his blood, or the act of actually doing it. The art of deception brings out the worst form of betrayal imaginable. Walking someone along that line so that you can get them the minute that they look away, or the minute that they put themselves in a compromised position. When this form of betrayal is being placated on a tier, everyone has their best game face on, and everyone's trying their hardest to camouflage all the outward signs that might cue the target. Fake smiles, fake humor, idle conversation, while at the same time trying to avoid eye contact with someone who's being betrayed. Imagine a bunch of chameleons trying to hide their deception, and trying to find ways to break the eerie silence that these situations create. Because that's what happens. It usually gets real quiet when everyone knows that someone's about to get hit. Not only that, but you also get a sick feeling in the pit of your stomach that comes from knowing you played a role in deceiving someone who you might have at one time been close to. So what ended up happening next is that in order for this hit to be facilitated the way that they wanted it to, required several people on the tier to pass when it was their turn to either come out for showers or tier time. Weddle from Elm Street Watts was a little ways down the tier from where Lil Man was, so this required some coordination by the others on the tier. In other words, I don't know if this happened during tier time or showers, but whichever it was, when the deputy popped Weddle's cell to come out, he looked out and signaled to the deputy that he passed. It was at this same time that he also jammed his door so that he could breach his door and come back out when Lil Man was on the tier. So after Weddle passes and quickly jams his door, they pop the next door and this guy passes. Then they pop the next door and this guy also passes. Everyone that was in between Weddle and Lil Man was told to pass. And of course, they all did. Keep in mind, when these doors are opening and closing, Weddle's posted up on his door listening and waiting until he heard them get to Lil Man's cell. So when they get to Lil Man's cell, he comes out oblivious of what's about to happen and he starts walking down the tier. No doubt, he still had his head on a swivel and he was still on his toes, but he obviously didn't know that this was in play. However, I'll just say this. Having been in a similar situation myself, Lil Man might have been oblivious to what was in play on the tier, but when you're in a situation like this, any break in monotony or a break in regular routine should have been a red flag for Lil Man. I'm willing to bet that it wasn't a normal practice for all these guys to pass on either showers or tier time, and this is what should have alerted Lil Man. If you're really on your toes in an environment like this, you're looking for any kind of subtle changes or anything that breaks a normal routine. If I would have heard all these guys passing and this wasn't a regular routine, I would have at the very least wondered why everybody on the tier was passing, especially since all movement in these types of environments are usually always mandatory. I know it's a little different when it comes to the Mexican Mafia and their following, but it's usually mandatory for them in these types of environments as well. But anyways, my source said that he knew it was happening as soon as he heard the screeching from their shoes on the floor. Whenever there's a fight, a stabbing, or any type of physical altercation, one of the telltale signs is hearing the rubber screeching on the polished wax floors from the combatants shifting around trying to get better traction. When my source heard this, he rushed up to his bars and used the mirrored glass to get a better look down the tier. Once Lil Man stepped out into the tier, Weddle darted out of his cell and the fight was on. In the reflection, my source could clearly see that Weddle and Lil Man were fighting on the tier. From his vantage point, he could see that Weddle had Lil Man pinned up against the wall and that he was jabbing at him with the piece. Keep in mind that my source and Lil Man were neighbors, so he didn't have to look far. As my source contorted himself into position so that he could get a better view, he could see that Lil Man was doing everything he could to defend himself. The difference between the two is that one was simply following a directive and trying to fulfill a responsibility, while the other was fighting for his life and obviously understood how dire this situation really was. My source said Lil Man was doing his shit. He was fighting Weddle off for everything he was worth, obviously knowing that his life was hanging in the balance. But he also said that Weddle was on him and that he just kept coming, and that Weddle was trying to give it to him. As they got closer to his field of view, my source said that Lil Man was dodging and blocking everything that Weddle was throwing, and that he was actually doing good. But as Lil Man was backpedaling down the tier, he ended up losing his footing and falling backwards. He actually fell right in front of my source's cell. When he hit the floor, this is when Weddle got him. Weddle started hitting him in the head, face, and shoulders. He said Lil Man was still trying to block him, but this was to no avail. Everything changed when Lil Man lost his footing. At that point, my source said, I just remember seeing a lot of blood. There was blood all over the tier, and Lil Man was covered in blood. He said he looked like someone just dumped a bucket of blood over his head. That shouldn't come as any surprise though. Head wounds always bleed profusely. Fortunately for Lil Man, he didn't take no nasty neck shots or any shots that ever put his life in danger. He somehow got lucky, or it just wasn't his day to go. My source said that when Weddle was standing over Lil Man did some exorcist type of shit where he crawled backwards on his hands and feet, like the exorcist spider walk. After he got out from under where Weddle was giving it to him, Little Man ran up to the front of the tier where there's an observation window that the deputies use to monitor the tier. Little Man ran straight towards that window, and when he got there, he just ran straight into it. My source said that the Hudas were already there waiting to cuff Little Man up and take him, because by then, they had already seen what was happening. At that point, Weddle slid the piece under my source's door and walked back down the tier. I can picture Little Man doing some acrobatic type of shit, where he runs backwards on his hands and feet, and then flips around in one quick move before running to that window. So after Weddle slid that weapon under my source's door, my source asked Checo what he wanted him to do with the weapon. He said, when Weddle slid the weapon under my door, the deputies were already running onto the tier. He said, I wasn't tripping on getting caught with the weapon. They could have walked right up on me. I was more concerned about getting in trouble with the homies. I was more worried about getting caught up for losing it. But Checo told him to just go ahead and flush it. He knew there wasn't enough time to salvage it. This is a common practice that's done anytime there's a lot of blood on the tier. I believe that this incident marked the third time that Little Man had been moved on, but he still wasn't sold on tapping out, and he continued to refuse any form of self-requested protective custody. Up until this point, all the attempts that were made on taking Little Man out transpired in custodial settings, meaning either in the county jail or in prison. As far as my source knew, there were no other attempts to take him out on the streets until years later in 2019. When Little Man was released in 2019, he reconnected with a woman he'd met in elementary school that he had known for years. From their younger years up until when they got back in touch, their relationship had mostly been platonic. They were just in two entirely different places in life, and neither one of them had any desire to commit to a serious relationship. But in 2019, everything changed. All the things that had held them back and prevented them from taking that step in the past had finally changed. And once it looked like the relationship might be for the long haul, Little Man eventually moved into her apartment in Chino, and everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Hoping to keep him from slipping into his old habits or going back to his old haunts, this woman, only identified in court by her initials, didn't even allow the few friends that he had from Whittier and his past to visit. She knew that if she allowed this to happen, that she would inevitably end up losing him, either to the streets or those who still had bad intentions. And she was right. Whether it was her own womanly intuition or just common sense, she was right. After all the adversity that Little Man had lived through, and after showing unwavering loyalty to an organization he committed his life to, this still didn't negate the fact that his name was still on the hard candy list. On November 19, 2021, just after 4 p.m., Little Man and his girl were walking back from the store when they saw a guy lingering on the grass outside of a building on Philadelphia Street. Although he was dressed like a legitimate businessman, he held what looked like a business card in a gloved hand. Little Man sensed something wasn't right about this guy, and his demeanor told his girl that he was uncomfortable. There was something suspicious about the gloved hand. Later, she would testify about all these events as they happened. The guy, who was later identified as Cesar Palomino, asked Little Man if he was Donald Ortiz. This right here was another red flag that Little Man unfortunately failed to pick up on. Under the circumstances, he should have either declined to answer this guy or just responded in the negative. Whether he was still under the impression that he had the ability to get back in good graces with the Mexican Mafia, he had to have known that he remained to be a target and that he had to be careful about who he encountered out there on the streets. Instead, he said he was. This guy's response was, "We need to talk to you about a homicide." Another critical red flag missed as Little Man allowed himself to be taken down this rabbit hole. Little Man said he didn't know anything about any homicides, but none of that mattered. He had already compromised his security and exposed himself to someone he was getting bad vibes from. Little Man was smarter than this, but for whatever reason, he threw all caution to the wind. "Are you sure you want to talk in front of her?" the man asked. Then, just as fast as he asked that last question, she saw the gun. She closed her eyes and plugged her ears with her fingers. She heard several shots. "I stood there with my eyes closed," she recalled, crying quietly, waiting to be shot next. "I stood there for what seemed like a long time. When I opened my eyes, I seen him walking away." Little Man was laid out in the gutter, shot point blank in the head and body several times. 2 9mm casings were found near his body. After almost 20 years and several failed attempts, the Mexican Mafia had finally made good on the green light that was placed on Little Man. The defendant, Cesar Palomino, sat about 20 feet from her, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and draped in shackles. "I don't believe so," she said. William Drake, a deputy public defender, seized on her failure to identify his client and arguing for the judge to dismiss the murder charge. But detectives knew that they had the right guy, and they weren't about to let this case slip away behind a technicality or a witness who obviously feared retaliation. Instead, they relied on other evidence: DNA, cell phone records, internet searches, surveillance, video, and recorded jail calls that indicated the man at the defense table was Lil Man's killer. It's believed that Lil Man's significant other failed to identify Palomino due to her fear of being targeted herself. She didn't come from the type of lifestyle that Lil Man was entrenched in, but she still knew who the Mexican Mafia was, and she was well aware of how deadly this organization could be. One of the detectives from the Chino Police Department had apparently reviewed the internet searches for all of Palomino's social media accounts, including Google, Safari, Bing, and others. And before Lil Man was killed, the detective testified that someone used those same accounts to look up Donald Ortiz, Mexican Mafia Lil Man, and MA Dropouts. The day after Lil Man's death, there was a search for Chino local news. It just goes to show how even the Mexican Mafia and its subordinates have advanced with the times by using Google search engines to manifest their illicit criminal agendas. What people need to understand is that law enforcement can track everybody who searched for someone like this. When someone searches for someone like Lil Man, they can track anyone who searched for a specific subject matter. Not just one person, but everybody who entered those same keystrokes. Like Lil Man, Palomino spent most of his life behind bars. He served brief terms for low-level drug and weapons offenses and longer stretches in federal prison for entering the country illegally. Records filed in these immigration cases describe a life spent with one foot on either side of the U.S.-Mexican border. A common theme amongst a lot of these guys who have family on the other side of the border. The prosecutor who prosecuted Palomino wrote in a sentencing memo that Palomino had joined Barrio Pobre, a small Long Beach gang, and that he had ties to the Mexican Mafia. Convicted of possessing a shotgun, Palomino was deported but was subsequently released pending an appeal. Ultimately, he failed to turn himself in after the challenge proved unsuccessful, and thus he was considered to be an absconder who was illegally in this country. 5 years later, Palomino pulled a blue Mitsubishi truck into the Mexican side of the Calexico port of entry. He told an inspector he had driven to Mexico from Los Angeles 2 days earlier to install antennas in Mexicali. He was also wearing a uniform and was trying to pass himself off as a legitimate worker. One can only wonder if this was the same uniform he was wearing when he took out Lil Man. The luggage in the truck, he volunteered, belonged to his business partner. It turns out that there was no luggage in the truck and that the inspector noticed that Palomino's hands were shaking. He obviously wasn't good at hiding his criminal mischief. This prompted authorities to search the truck, where they found 28 cellophane-wrapped bundles of marijuana, about 60 pounds in all. Palomino admitted that he'd been paid $2,000 to deliver the load to Los Angeles. After Lil Man's death, authorities obtained what is called a geofence warrant, which requires technology companies to turn over a list of all cell phones active in a particular area and time frame. Based on surveillance video, detectives believe Lil Man's killer drove a white Infiniti Q50 sedan. Combing through the data from the warrant, they found only 3 phone accounts had been at several locations where the Infiniti had been spotted. The accounts were associated with one person, Cesar Palomino. The day Lil Man died, literally within minutes after 4 p.m., Palomino's phone was in Hesperia, California, where his family lived. At 2:30 p.m., geolocation data showed that the phone traveled along the 15 and 60 freeways, exiting at Central Avenue in Chino at around 4:06 p.m. 20 minutes later, the phone arrived at a street behind Lil Man's apartment complex and transmitted no signal for about 20 minutes, indicating that it had been turned off. By 7 p.m., the phone had returned to Hesperia. Detectives sent the 2 casings found near Lil Man's body for DNA testing, which confirmed Palomino's DNA was on the expended shells. This evidence was irrefutable, and they had enough circumstantial evidence to wipe Palomino out with or without the cooperation of Lil Man's girl. Authorities arrested Palomino in Las Vegas in April of 2022 and searched his home. where they found a black blazer and black Italian dress boots that resembled those worn by the guy captured in the surveillance video fleeing the scene of the crime. Extradited to San Bernardino, Palomino made a call from the county jail. According to a detective with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, Palomino told an unidentified relative, "They told me if you eat a butterfly, you become a butterfly." The butterfly, whose wings form the shape of an M, is one of the Mexican Mafia's insignias. These detectives said that they believed Palomino had been told that if he killed a Mexican Mafia member like Lil Man, that he would become one himself. The final piece of evidence that solidified the case against Palomino was his direct association to Manuel Snuffy Quintero, who was described as being a known active member of the Mexican Mafia. Snuffy ended up being one of Palomino's contacts. It's open for speculation, but Snuffy might have been the one who pointed Palomino in Lil Man's direction. As with most of the stories that I put out, there's a lot to take away from this one. Lil Man was obviously one of those prideful type of guys who refused to accept the fact that the Mexican Mafia had closed the door on him. Whether he didn't want to accept the circumstances he was in because his heart was still in it, or because he didn't want people to see him go out ass backwards, he continued placing himself in harm's way until it ultimately cost him his life. His abstract way of thinking was that maybe his so-called brothers in arms would see his unwavering loyalty and that they would deem this worthy of some kind of praise or recognition, and that if he continued to fall on the sword, that maybe they would bring him back into the fold. At some point, reason has to supersede any form of false or fake sense of pride. A lot of us are born into this lifestyle at a very young age. For some of us, our families and loved ones are entrenched in it as well. It becomes a way of life, a culture, and we invest a considerable amount of effort trying to maintain solid reputations because we care way too much about what others think about us. In the big scheme of things, how others perceive you, what others think about you, or what other people say are trivial and insignificant. At some point in life, when you actually start living your life and you allow yourself to remove the blinders, some of you will realize this. In closing, I'll just say this. To those of you who were also once a part of this lifestyle and who also ended up on that list, don't make the same kind of fatal mistake Lil Man made by allowing yourself to believe that you may have become any less of a priority or that the threat has minimized simply because several decades have passed. That's a dangerous way of thinking, and you guys know better. Never allow yourself to underestimate the ill intentions of these criminal organizations. If you do, and if the right people are in play, you could end up becoming another hapless victim like Lil Man. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you guys think. As always, I want to thank all of you for tapping in and for continuing to support the channel. I've got more stories dropping, so stay tapped in for the next one. Anyways, as this one goes out, I'm already working on the next one. I'll be doing a live sometime soon so that I can address a couple of things that some of you have been asking about in the comments. And also, just to interact with you guys since it's been a minute. You guys enjoy the rest of your week and keep pushing that positivity. With that said, this is your boy B, and I'm out.